Good morning. I'd like to read to you today from James chapter 5 and verse 7. Be patient then, brothers, until the Lord's coming. See how the farmer waits for the land to yield its valuable crop, and how patient he is for the autumn and spring rains. You too, be patient and stand firm, because the Lord's coming is near. Don't grumble against each other, brothers, or you will be judged. The judge is standing at the door. Brothers, as an example of patience in the face of suffering, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we consider blessed those who have persevered. You've heard of Job's perseverance and have seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. I don't know what view you tend to take of history, but historians tend to take either a very pessimistic view of history, that things are gradually getting worse and worse, or they have a very optimistic view of history, that, like in Star Trek, things are evolving into greater and greater levels of harmony and understanding and peace. These days, a lot of historians take a very cynical view of history, that history is really just a cycle of random events going round and round, just one random event after another, with no real meaning, with no beginning, with no end, with no middle, with no story, just random events that are meaningless. The Bible takes a very different view of history. It sees history as linear, that it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And the author of this story of the world and of the universe is God. I've got a whole bunch of books behind me. And when an author sits down to write a book, they have a beginning, they have a middle, and they have a conclusion. And no matter how epic and big the novel ends up being, and no matter how many plot twists and turns and tangents and character changes and so on there are during the story, ultimately the author will bring the story to a dramatic conclusion. And the author of history has a story that he is telling. And it is a story, no matter how many plots and twists and turns there are, it's a story that will have a dramatic conclusion. It tells us here in James, be patient then until the Lord's coming. There is an end in view. Everything is working towards a conclusion where all the tangled mess and tangents of life will come together into a perfectly ordered, satisfying and wonderful conclusion. Now, the picture that we have here in James is not so much of a book that's being written, but rather of a field that has been sown by a farmer. James seems to be quite keen on his farming analogies. He talks about humbly accepting the word that's been planted in us. He talks about yielding a harvest of righteousness in our lives and so on. And here he uses the picture of a farmer who waits for his land to yield its valuable crop, and how he is patient for the autumn and the summer rains. And so what we have here is a picture in Palestine then and now. There's a distinctive climate, which means that in October time there are the autumn rains, and those rains soften the soil so that it can receive the seed and enable the seeds to germinate. Then the farmer has to wait for what may seem like a long period of time through to the spring, through to March, April time, when there's another rain that comes, and that rain enables the grain to swell to full maturity and ripeness. And then there's a valuable harvest that the farmer can reap. And the picture that we're given here is that even though there are no interventions from above during this long season between the autumn and spring rains, during that time the farmer needs to be patient, but not passive. And so for us, we may feel that there's very little coming from above. There's very little intervention coming from above. There's so many injustices, so many difficulties, so many trials, so many tests, and nothing coming from above to help us. But be patient, we're told, as we wait for the Lord's coming. Be patient, but don't be passive. The farmer, during that time, doesn't just put up his feet and watch Coronation Street. He's out there watching the crop, tending the crop, fertilizing, weeding, making sure that the crop is growing properly. And so too we are to, during this time of waiting, tend out the crop, the harvest that is supposed to be growing in our lives. And so we're not supposed to be passive. And there are two temptations that we can face. In fact, there's three in this passage. I'm just going to talk about two of them right now. The two temptations that we can face when we are having to wait a long time for something is one, impatience. The writer here talks about impatience several times and tells us not to be impatient. That impatience could be an impatience with God. God, where are you? When are you going to show up and do something? But I think especially here, the impatience is a potential impatience with injustice that's around and with the people that are around. In the previous section that before I read this in chapter 5, we read of the harvesters who are crying out for justice because the wealthy farmers are not paying them their wages, even though they worked hard to bring in the harvest. And there's injustice in the world, and there's inequality in the world. And James doesn't write and say, you need to have a revolution. You need to have the proletariat rising up against the bourgeoisie to revolt against this injustice and so on. Rather, he tells these people to be patient and to wait for the Lord to bring justice. And so the patience that they're encouraged to have is a self-restraint that does not easily retaliate against injustice, but rather allows this period of trial and difficulty to actually produce something valuable in their lives, something of a character which cannot be replaced, which is incredibly valuable, a valuable crop, as it says in verse 7. At the end of it all, if you submit to God during a time of trial, if you allow him to teach you and work in you, if you soften your heart so that you're prepared to actually hear God speaking to you during this time, then you can come out of it richer and better rather than poorer and bitter. You can have his character. You can have a harvest of righteousness if you are patient. The second temptation that these people were facing here was what I'm going to call, if you like, a wobbly heart. He talks about how they need to stand firm. And James keeps referring right through the letter of James to this whole issue of being double-minded, of having a divided heart, of having split loyalties, of vacillating between, am I living for God or am I living for myself and for the world? What are my priorities? What am I living for? And he keeps speaking to them about this issue of being double-minded. In chapter 2, verse 4, he talks about people judging with evil thoughts. That's kind of the idea that these people are sort of weighing up the pros and cons of their actions, not in light of what is right and wrong, but in light of what they can get out of it if they do this or if they do that, and they're just double-minded. He talks again in chapter 4, verse 4, about adultery, this two-timing God, so that they have friendship with the world, but also friendship with God. And they're kind of hedging their bets, and they're keeping both things going. Yeah, we'll keep God a little bit happy on the side, but we're also going to live for the world and love the world. And there's this double-mindedness about them. And he tells them that they're to wash their hands and to purify their hearts, and to stop being double-minded. And now in this passage here, he says to them, be patient and stand firm. That phrase, stand firm, means establish your hearts, or have a fixed heart. The Greek is sterizo, which means to have a fixed heart. It's the word that is used of Jesus in Luke chapter 9, where it says that Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. He was on a mission and no one was going to stop him. It speaks of a determined setting of your face to something, a resolution, a clarity of thinking that you know what you're living for, you know why you're here, you know that you've got a mission and nothing's going to stop you. And so you've set your heart, you've established your hearts. As the Apostle Paul says, stand firm then, and let nothing move you. And so we're told here to stand firm. Let me ask you, have you settled in your heart what your priorities are? Have you decided what you're living for? Have you purged yourself of any compromise of different priorities and different values and living for different things, so that you're clear and you're actually saying, I've set my heart, I have established my heart, I have fixed my heart to do God's will wholeheartedly, and without any holding back. And then finally, the writer here, James, he gives us two examples to encourage us. In our patience and in our steadfastness of heart, he reminds us firstly of the prophets. And he says, think of the prophets as an example of patience in suffering. Take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord. As you know, we consider blessed those who persevered. James was surely thinking of people like Jeremiah, who spoke a very unpopular message to a people who didn't want to hear what he had to say. And so his own family betrayed him. And so he was beaten, he was put in stocks. He ended up being thrown into a cistern where he was left to starve, in waist high in mud in that cistern, until eventually he was rescued. Surely James is thinking of someone like Ezekiel, who we're told lost his wife. His wife died in chapter 24. He faced the pain of bereavement in his life, and yet that ended up being the setting for his ministry. These people did not find it easy. They didn't have an easy life, and yet they had a special calling, and we now consider them blessed. I'd rather be one of them, wouldn't you? Clear, patient, trusting God, setting my heart on him, whatever the consequences, but actually not being like those nameless false prophets in the Old Testament who really just did things for money. They were double-minded. And then finally, he gives us the example of Job. Job, who we read of his legendary perseverance as he lost everything, one thing after another. He lost it all. So he's almost just him, naked on the ground, with two friends who are not any help at all to him. And yet we find that Job, as we're told here, persevered, and we've seen what the Lord finally brought about in his life. And so we find that Job, though he's being tested, he says, I will not curse the name of God. His wife tells him, well, curse God. Job says, you're talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? A little bit later on, Job says in chapter 19, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes. how my heart yearns within me. In the thick of the trials, Job is able to say, I know that my Redeemer lives. And at the end, he testifies, yes, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. And then, of course, we read at the end of his life that he gets more material and familial blessing than even in the first half of his life. He ends up with such a bounty of blessing in his life. But he had to persevere before he saw the blessing. And we're told here in James, you have heard of Job's perseverance and seen what the Lord finally brought about. The Lord is full of compassion and mercy. Job experienced in the end God's blessing. The richest blessing that Job experienced was not the material prosperity that he ended up with, but it was instead that he had seen God for himself. He'd experienced God. He'd gone deeper with God. He'd been changed by God. His character. There was a harvest in his life now. That was the ultimate blessing. And it can be for you and for me if we submit ourselves to God during this time of testing and trial. If we are patient, if we set our hearts fully on him, then we too can experience a deeper harvest of righteousness that is invaluable in our lives. And it says at the end, the Lord is full of compassion and mercy. He is abundantly tender-hearted. That's what full of compassion means. Polysplagchnos. God is multi-intestined. He is fully compassionate, abundantly tender-hearted, and wants to show it to you. And he is full of mercy. That word mercy is a summary word that speaks for all that God has ever done and ever will do for us in Christ. He is full of mercy, and he wants you and me to experience that compassion and that mercy here and now in our lives, at the end of this season we're going through, and ultimately when he does return at the end of history to make all things right. Thanks for listening. Tomorrow I'm going to look at a very interesting topic on Friday of grumbling against one another. Please do join me then if you can.